Good morning, everyone. It's good to have us all together to look at the lesson this week, lesson number 7. And a welcome to those people who are zooming in from other places around the world. Nice to have you with us, even if you're just next door in your lounge room. So our lesson this morning comes to you from one of the classes of Springwood Church, and this is the back corner class. So we're trying to make it a little bit interactive this morning, and we'll see how we go. Our lesson today is on Isaiah chapter 36 through to 39. So if you've got your Bible or you've got your electronic device, more than happy for you to follow that through, because we're going to refer to a few verses through Isaiah 36. And at the start of verse 36, chapter 36, verse 1, it actually says, "Now it came to pass." Question for you. If you're in a group of people, you're sitting around having a yarn, and someone says to you, "Now I remember that," what is about to happen? What is your expectation that's about to happen? And someone's going to start a story. I remember that. Isn't that what people say when we're sitting there? "Oh, by the way, I remember that." And so when we look at verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass." That's the same sort of concept as, "I remember that." And so we start a new story here in Isaiah. This is this is the new section. Yeah. And so that's now. And now look, let me tell you this story. So now we're moving into the story. This story is more, this part of Isaiah is probably more historical than prophetic. It does show God's miracles happening, but as far as I could see, there's not a lot of prophecy in there. Isaiah does interpret God's words to Hezekiah, which happened to come true, but we'll get to that. So in summary, we're going to look at the war that Judea has with Sennacherib, the Assyrian army. And then we're going to talk about, if we get time, talk about the illness of Hezekiah and then the Babylonians. So that's where our lesson is based this week. And as usual, the stories in Isaiah are paralleled in 2 other books of the Bible. And we've referred to those a few times through the lesson. Do you remember what the other 2 books that seem to parallel the stories of Isaiah are? Right back in the early part of the Old Testament. Kings, very good. 2 Kings in particular, very good. And the other ones that tells the same sort of stories as Kings? Chronicles. Because Chronicles is another word for keeping the record. So both Kings, 2 Kings 18 to 20 and 2 Chronicles 29 are paralleling and add to our story today. Let's just have a quick overview of what the purpose of the prophet was. In your mind, God placed these prophets in Israel. What was the reason he did that? What was their job? What was their role? What was the purpose of these prophets?
Indicating the will of God to the nation.
Excellent. To do exactly that, indicate the will of God to the nation, and particularly to bring to their memory the things that had happened in the past where God had led. The Exodus in particular. What else? What else was the job of the prophet?
He provided a spiritual support.
He did, absolutely. He was not the spiritual leader usually, because that was the high priest's job, but he certainly led people to the high priest and to what God was revealing through him. Anything else do you think the prophets did? You got something there, Peter, come on.
Well, it's been pretty well covered. But he was a man of God firstly.
True.
And I would think in all cases he was appointed by God.
True.
And
So
what-
he was
what
God's
his-
mouthpiece
what was
then,
his
wasn't
job then? To
Yeah.
show the people God.
Yeah. To
And
interpret.
plenty of cases to bring them back to God because they'd run away from him.
So when there was a crisis in Israel, a national crisis, he was there to advise the king, but also to give advice on this national crisis. And when the crisis had passed, he was there then to give hope and comfort to the people. And in some cases, the prophets were also judges in the early stages, weren't they? They were the judges and the prophets. Isaiah was one of these prophets, and we've been talking about that. And he had served God as an advisor to the kings for 60 years at this stage. His ministry spanned 4 kings of Judah. I wonder how many of those 4 kings we can think of. I'll give you the first one. When he came to, when Isaiah came to prominence, Isaiah, or Azariah, as he's also called, was the king. Now, here's a 50-50 choice for you. Good king or bad king? Azariah. You can only be right or wrong. There's no other option.
Good king.
He was a good king. He was a good king. Now, Azariah's son was Jotham. Now, if you remember a few weeks ago when I took the lesson, Jotham came up in the discussion because Jotham is the father of someone we talked about particularly a few weeks ago. Jotham, his other name was Jonathan. He was the king. He was the son of Azariah. Good king or bad king?
Not so good.
It wasn't too bad. Wasn't a good father, but as a king he's put in the good lot, not the bad lot. His son, the grandson of Azariah, his son, guess who he was? Starts with an A, and we talked about him a few weeks ago. Ahaz, King Ahaz. Ahaz, good or bad? Really not very good at all. Remember the stories where he went and did a treaty with the Assyrians so that he could make sure that the Israelis and the Samaritans couldn't come in and take his country, and then he brought in the Baal worship and Moloch and the sacrifices of children and all that sort of stuff. So he really was a bad king. And in that process, he set up paying duty, if you like, back to the Assyrians to protect their kingdom from the other kingdoms around. Now, Ahaz's son, the 4th king, the one we're talking about today, Hezekiah. And at this point, Isaiah moves, after Hezekiah, Isaiah moves off the scene. Do you remember who Hezekiah's son was, the king that took over from Hezekiah? Starts with an M. Manasseh? Yep. So, and we have nothing in Isaiah that talks about Manasseh. So we assume that Isaiah sort of life ended around about the same time that King Hezekiah's life ended. Hezekiah, good king, bad king? Good king. Excellent. Okay, so let's focus on our study for today. King Ahaz has died. And what do we know about King Ahaz? Well, we said before, not a good king. Set up lots of idols. Did a treaty with, I don't know whether you remember this, but he did a treaty with Tiglath-Pileser. His name is Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria. That treaty was to pay him money, basically the protection money to look after him from the Israelites and the Samaritans, the Syrians. So then his son Hezekiah becomes king. Hezekiah unbelievably obeys God. However, his kingdom, the kingdom of Judea, is not free. And he's still paying this protection money back to Assyria. So when the king, how do I put this? King Tiglath-Pileser passes away, and his son takes over rulership. And his name is Sargon. Now, Sargon is regarded as probably the primary empire builder of Assyria. But Sargon was not the guy that was supposed to take over as king. His older brother was, and he did for a while, but Sargon II comes in and knocks his brother off and takes over the kingdom. And so while all this is going on, there's a reign for rulership of the Assyrian Empire. So there's distractions from keeping your hands on your empire. And as this distraction occurs, some of the countries that they are ruling notice a weakness, and they start to form rebellions. And then Sargon gets killed in the battle, and his son Sennacherib comes to rule. And this again, we see a changeover of king, and this weakness continues. Now, Hezekiah, down there in Judea, realises there's a weakness going on here. And so what he does is he rounds up a few of his neighbouring kings, and they decide to get on the rebellion bandwagon, and they rebel against Assyria too. And so you've got all these countries, these little countries now, in this process of rebellion against the Assyrians. Of course, Sennacherib now builds up his power, and he decides he's going to squash all this rebellion, and so he heads off with his army to quell the rebellion. He works his way from Assyria, and one of the ones that were giving him a whole heap of trouble were the Philistines. Supposed to have had a treaty with him. But he moves on down to the edge of the coast of the Mediterranean to Philistia, where the Philistines were. He calms the rebellion, he makes them pay tribute back to him again, and then he says, right, I got you lot sorted out, now I've got to go and sort out Hezekiah and those Judeans. So he turns around, and if you remember, you've got the Mediterranean Sea here, you've got the Philistines living here, and right next to them was Judea. And up above that is Israel and Syria and the Assyrians up above that. So Sennacherib decides, right, I'm going to move across here now, sort out Hezekiah, get him sorted out, and then I'll head off and sort out some of the others. This is the basis of the lesson today. This is where it's all situated around that little story. Hezekiah, in all the rebellion that's going on, realises that Sennacherib is not going to put up with it for too much longer. He's already seen him go to the Philistines, to Philistia. And so Hezekiah calls the people together. They start building the walls of Jerusalem up. One of the things they did was they put in a viaduct, or actually it was a tunnel, from the water system that was outside the city and ran it into the city. So Hezekiah's theory was, if they were sieged, the water would be running into the city from the springs that were outside the city. Now, I haven't been there, but I'm told if you go to this area, and it's Salome, there is actually a plaque that recognises that Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, around about 720 BC or something like that, actually built this tunnel that comes into the city. Have you seen it, Johnny?
No, I haven't,
Yeah.
but I've seen a lot of photos.
Yeah. And so Hezekiah was trying to do all that he could do to protect Jerusalem, because he knew that sooner or later Sennacherib was going to come. He didn't realise Sennacherib was going to come in the way he came. but he knew he was going to come. Sennacherib turns, and as he comes towards Judea, he comes across the first city called Lachish. Now, Lachish is the second largest city in Judea after Jerusalem. Way over towards the Philistines, where the Philistines lived, towards the Mediterranean Sea. Sennacherib hits that, and he can't believe what happens, because Lachish is a city in the hills, and it's a walled city, but inside the city is a castle. And on the walls of the castle, the governor of that area has all his archers from his own army. Now, this is a ramshackled lot of army. They weren't well trained, they knew very little, but they had archers. And so the archers are on the wall of Lachish, and every time Sennacherib brings his army a bit closer and a bit closer, they just fire off all these arrows, and it rains arrows on top of him, and so he falls back again. And what Sennacherib thought would only take a few days to sort out has become a problem for him. So he sets a siege around Lachish, and he stays there, and he looks, and he mans that siege himself. But in the so doing, he comes up with the idea that it is better to persuade someone to surrender than to pillage the town and kill everyone, because you don't get much money out of that. So he sends off a guy to go to Jerusalem. Now, do you remember? Jerusalem is 50 kilometres away, all right? 50 kilometres inland from Lachish. Do you remember how Isaiah refers to the name of this guy that Sennacherib sends? Starts with an R. It's not a name, it's a position. He calls him a Rabshakeh. Now the Rabshakeh, the Rabshakeh is really an important person for the king. In fact, he's called the chief of princes. He's the cupbearer to the king. He's probably the second most important person in the kingdom to the king. But he is the mouthpiece of the king, and he is, how could you describe? You know when we have football and cricket games and people badmouth each other and they tease and torment each other, and what do we call that? Sorry?
Rabble-rousers.
Yeah, rabble-rousers, big mouths, foul mouths, all of those sort of words. That's the Rabshakeh. Okay? He's the classic arrogant bad guy. He's the trash talker.
Tennis players.
He's the mouthpiece of the king that trash talks you into persuading you to do something before the king comes along with his army. And this is Isaiah 36 verse 2 says this. Then the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And he stood by the aqueduct from the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, Joha, the son of Asaph, the recorder, went down from the king's palace to meet this man. The field commander said to them, "Tell Hezekiah." And then it goes on to talk about what the Rabshakeh, the arrogant badmouther, the mouthpiece of the king, with the help of 180,000 armed forces behind him, comes to tell Hezekiah. And friends, the next bit of what is said is an amazing bit of oratory. It's a whole lot of trash talk, but it's an amazing set of oratory. Got to put you in the situation, okay? We've heard about the launderer's field before and the upper pool, because this is, you remember, this is where Isaiah met Ahaz and talked to Ahaz about, you know, you won't be conquered. Don't worry about the Assyrians. They won't do anything to you. So it's the same sort of area, and it's just outside the walls of the city. And this is where the Rabshakeh comes, and he starts to talk to these. Hezekiah sent down his main administrators, his, if you like, his executive officer team, down to hear what he has to say. And the Rabshakeh starts to say, you guys, you got no hope. You're wasting your time. And let me share a few things. He says, Judah cannot trust Egypt. They won't help you. Now, Hezekiah had formed an allegiance with Egypt and Ethiopia to try and fight off the Assyrians when they came. And the Rabshakeh knows about this, and he said, they're not going to help you. And he says, you can't depend on the Lord, because Hezekiah has taken down all the sacrifices and all the idols everywhere. So God, your God would be very unhappy with that, so you can't rely on him. The Lord is now on the side of the Assyrians, not on your side. The Lord told them that Sennacherib would totally destroy them. He said, you don't even have enough trained men to mount the horses that we offered you. Because what had happened is Sennacherib had offered him 2,000 horses and chariots if he was prepared to fight for the Assyrians. And of course they said no. But the speaker on behalf of the king, the Rabshakeh, turns this around and said, you didn't even have enough men to put on them. You don't have enough food to eat. You don't have enough water to drink. Hezekiah cannot save you. And he said, just look at all the other countries. Their gods couldn't save them. So what do you think your God's going to save you from us? So all this bad mouth talk is going on. And it's not just the executive officers that have come down from Hezekiah's palace that are listening to this.
There was another argument. They already roll over 40 cities before they
Yep.
enter Jerusalem.
That's right. That's right. 46 cities we've conquered. Can I just build and grab that for a minute? Because we want to come back to that. Sennacherib, back in his palace in Assyria, had a big wall, a big curved wall. And on this curved wall, he had his scribes and those people that do all this writing and plaster modelling and all that, tell stories of all of his conquests as he'd gone around the countries. So there were stories of every country he went in and every major city, and we are told that on this wall was the story of 46 cities that he had conquered, including Lachish. All right, we're going to come back to that in a minute later on, but it's very important. Thank you for that. So what the Rabshakeh is saying, you guys just might as well give up. There is no hope for you. We're here, we're going to take you over. If you give up, you won't be killed. And he says, what's more, if you trust in us, if you trust in what we will do, we will give you food. We will let you work your vineyards. You'll be able to eat the figs off your own trees. We'll look after you. And we'll do all that for free. Free my eye. They'd already been taking protection money off of them for years. And now they were going to do it for free? Not likely. What is the Rabshakeh doing here? What is he doing?
Propaganda.
Propaganda, that's exactly what I reckon. He's taking elements of truth and he's embellishing it with a whole heap of falsehood to tell a story. Do you know anyone else that does that?
Could say most politicians, but the devil knew the art when he first came to earth.
And that's where I was going too, Peter.
Been a pretty good teacher.
Yeah. Because we're in the Garden of Eden, there was emblems of truth, and there was a whole lot of falsehood. And this is how the Rabshakeh worked. I'll tell you emblems of truth so that you know what I'm talking about is true to a certain degree, but then I'm going to embellish it with a whole heap of other things, so you're going to assume that is true as well. And I think we see that with a lot of leaders who try and take over power.
Back in the 1930s, was it 37 or 38, I think, a certain gentleman came back from Germany, waved his umbrella and he said, "Peace in our time." He'd been fooled by the Rabshakeh.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. So Hezekiah is hearing all this, and there's a great story because he actually tells the Rabshakeh to shut up and not shout this out loud, because the Rabshakeh feels, well, if I'm being told that, I'm being successful, so he just shouts more. But in this whole process, Hezekiah says what? In response to all these promises, the abuse, the innuendos, the falsehood, the questions on his own ability, what does Hezekiah do? That's right, he says nothing. He shuts his mouth and says nothing. How many times have you ever been involved in, let's say, not an argument, but a discussion which is getting towards an argument, and you know there's a whole heap of rubbish that's being talked, but if you turn around and buy into this discussion, you're not going to have any success at all, because they're only convinced of their own rhetoric, and the better course is just to plain shut up. And that's what Hezekiah does. So I don't know how Sennacherib hears this story, but Hezekiah is worried. And so Hezekiah goes off and sends people to talk to Isaiah. And what is Isaiah, what was the promise Isaiah made? Let's see if we can find the verse. Verse 6 in chapter 37, I think it is. Isaiah said to them, has anyone got it there at all? Verse
Do
37.
not be afraid of the words which you just heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me.
Okay. So God is telling Isaiah is telling the executive officers for Hezekiah, don't be afraid of this. We've got this covered for you guys. And what does verse 7 say?
Surely I will send the Spirit upon him, and he shall hear the rumors and return to his own land.
And there I will cut him down with a sword.
In his own land.
In his own land. Not only is Isaiah telling Hezekiah, don't worry about this, I've got it covered. But he tells him how he's got it covered. Because Sennacherib's going to retreat. He's going to run off to his own, back to Assyria, and he's going to be murdered. Man alive, what sort of confidence would that give you if you were the king? And you're facing 185,000 soldiers out there. You're facing the Rabshakeh out here telling all sorts of stories to your people, unsettling them and ruining their confidence. And Isaiah comes and says that. Don't worry about this. God's got this covered. At a sign shortly, he's going to disappear. You're going to go back home and someone's going to murder him. In fact, the version I looked up, it says, listen, when he hears a certain report, I will make him, God, I will make him want to return to his own country. And there, God, I will have him cut down with the sword. So God wasn't leaving this to chance. He was saying, I've got this covered. I've got this covered, Hezekiah. Don't worry about it. It's all sorted. So Hezekiah's feeling a bit better about the whole thing. Somehow, Sennacherib hears about that discussion. Don't know how he does it. But he sends a message to Hezekiah this time. And the message says, don't believe the God you trust when he says Jerusalem will not be defeated by the kings of Assyria. You have heard, and this is verse 10 to 12, you have heard that the kings of Syria did to all the other countries. He destroyed them completely. Will you be saved? No. Did the gods of those people save them? No. And this was written on a message to Hezekiah from the king Sennacherib. So Hezekiah now is shaking in his boots again, or his sandals in this case. And this time he doesn't go to Isaiah. Where does he go? Do you remember where he goes to? He's in Jerusalem. Where would you go if you just received a message like that? Go to the temple. He did. And he not just goes into the temple, he goes right into the centre of the temple to where the cherubims are standing over the altar there. He places the message on the altar and he says, God, tell me what to do. He totally humbles himself. There is no pride in him. He's at the bottom end of everything. He says, God, tell me what to do. And he's got the message sitting there on the altar. Well, what happens? Do you know what happens?
God worked a miracle.
God works a miracle. Everyone goes to bed that night. They wake up the next morning, and what do they find?
Lots of dead people.
185,000 dead people laying around the place everywhere. You know, the strange thing to me is, I mean, that's an unbelievable miracle. But it says they went to bed that night and they woke up the next morning and found these people as they went wandering around the place. It must have been like the quietest killing battle that ever happened. No one woke up. No one went out to see what was going on. When the soldiers were falling over, holding all their spears and in their armour from guard and dying on the ground, no one even heard them rattle as they crashed to the ground. Nothing. Nothing. So they go outside, bodies everywhere. Just imagine. I don't know whether you've seen the MCG at an AFL Grand Final on TV, I'm sure. Do you know how many people fit in the MCG?
About 30, doesn't it?
No, more than that.
40?
More than that.
Around about 100 at a push.
Just on 100,000. 98 or 102 or whatever, depending on how this is.
The biggest crowd ever was for the 1956 Olympic Games. And that was just under that 100,000.
MCG with 100,000 people in, and I don't know whether you've seen them on camera as they pan around. There is people everywhere. I mean, they are so high up in those stands that they would get height sickness, air sickness, whatever you call it. They're so high.
Altitude sickness.
Yeah, altitude sickness. You're looking down at the football match and you're watching the ants run around with different coloured jerseys on. That's about all you can see. 100,000 people. Nearly double that. And as the Judeans walked outside of their house that morning, they saw 185,000 people dead.
And what we don't know is how they got rid of the bodies.
Exactly. Any speculation, Peter?
Well, perhaps God worked another miracle.
Yeah, well, they didn't bring in the bulldozers and dig big pits to push them into, did they? So whether they burnt them all or whatever, I guess there were a lot of fires going on around, a lot of barbecues happening about that time. So What happens to Sennacherib when he hears this? That's the sign. That's the sign. He turns around and he marches off back home. He doesn't tell everyone that that's what happened, because the stories that seem to come out from Sennacherib are very different. His record says that he made Hezekiah the Jew a prisoner in Jerusalem in his royal palace. I made Hezekiah the same as a bird in a cage. That's taken from one of the archaeological records that they found in Assyria. But nowhere on that wall we were talking about before, of all the defeated cities that Sennacherib had stories about, is Jerusalem, because he did not conquer Jerusalem. I guess it is amazing when miracles like that happen, and we just can't even fathom what's going on. So Sennacherib goes home. Now, the other part of the promise that Isaiah shared with Hezekiah was that Sennacherib would go home, but what else? We referred to it a little while ago. What else? He was going to be murdered. So here's the story of how that happened. I can't find it, but I'll tell you about it. Sennacherib goes up to his temple to worship his god, Ninroch or something like that it's called. And as he's in the temple worshipping, two guys, and it says their names, and for the life of me, I've got it in my notes here, but I can't even find it. But these two guys come in and they kill him with a sword. They run a sword through him and kill him while he's worshipping his god in his own temple. Then they take off and head off to, it says, the modern interpretation would be the area of Turkey. So they disappear to Turkey. Okay? The story unfolds that Sennacherib's second son is responsible for these assassins. Sennacherib's first son has died in battle. Mind you, Sennacherib had 11 sons. So it's a bit hard to work out all which one, first, second, third, right down to 11. But the story goes that Sennacherib's first son is dead. The second one thinks it's time for me to be king. He sends in the assassins. The assassins kill Sennacherib. He comes to claim the kingdom. But Sennacherib knew that he was an evil, nasty fellow. And while he was away, Sennacherib had sent him away to look after, to fight some battles for him. While he was away, he tells everyone who will be king, and it won't be this guy. In fact, it's another one of his sons further down the line. And so, even when Sennacherib dies, the upheaval that's caused in Assyria continues to occur as they fight over who's going to be king. All right, I've got 2 minutes to go. Let's move on very quickly. The devil cannot take Jerusalem using the Assyrians. So what does he turn to do? How is he going to take Jerusalem? He turns on Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, after this huge victory, this huge mountain he's on, this huge high that he's just been through, sending the Assyrians back home, what happens to him? What happens to him? He gets sick. He gets so sick that Isaiah sends a messenger to him. And what does the messenger say to him?
Put your house in order.
You're going to die. Put your house in order. Get everything right. And we know the story where Hezekiah does not, well, no one wants that to happen to them. So he goes to the temple and he pleads for the Lord to save him, to give him some more life. And what does God do to him, for him?
14 years.
15 years, gives him extra 15 years. And he says, I'll give you a sign even. And what was the sign? That was going to happen. He's going to get 15 years. Something to do with the sun.
Go backwards.
The shadow was going to move on the sun.
In fact, it says in Isaiah, it talks about the stairs of Ahaz. Now, there's a bit of a story here. Let me share it with you.
Oh, that's true. That's actually true. They recorded it.
Yeah. So King Ahaz, the evil king, when he was king, redesigned the temple. And he put a new set of stairs down on the eastern side of the temple. Now, what way does the sun go down? Western side, all right? So the sun is going down on the western side, the temple, the stairs. When the sun's up here, no shadow on the stairs, all right? Sun moves over here, temple here, shadow starts to walk down the stairs. And we're told in Isaiah that God promises to turn the sun back. How many steps? It even tells us how many steps. That sun moved back in the sky so that the shadow went up 10 steps.
It says 10 degrees.
10 degrees, which equated to 10 steps. I mean, other translations say 10 steps too. So hopefully I'm not making it up. But it come back up 10 steps. So that's a fair way. If you think about that, the sun has gone down and there's 10 steps in the shadow. The sun comes back and gradually the sun comes up the 10 steps again. Who notices that?
Astronomers.
The astronomers where?
Babylonians.
In Babylonia. They noticed all that. And King Murdoch Baladan listens to this and he hears the story that Hezekiah, the king of Judea, is so strong, he's routed the Assyrians back home. Somehow he's killed Sennacherib. And not only that, his God makes the sun goes backwards. So what is the king of Babylon thinking about Hezekiah?
Powerful leader.
What a man! I want him on my side. I want him, if he's on my side, the Assyrians have got no hope. And so he sends all these people over to check in with Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, we go more than that. Give me another 5. Hezekiah is greeted by these people who absolutely revere what he's done. He's such a powerful king. So powerful that humble little king with no pride that bared his soul before God at the altar is now what? What's changed? He's a bit puffed up now, isn't he? He's starting to believe his own advertising. He's a legend in his own lunchtime now. And so he goes off to show the Babylonians all the wealth that he has. And we know, well, we can't go on because that's the next story. We've got to stop here. Can I just say, in closing, I guess it's about who you're going to put your trust in. The Rabshakeh was about putting their trust in him. God says, put your trust in me. Can God be trusted? I think we have tried him enough times to know that. But even when calamities come, we have doubt. But when you look at the story of Hezekiah, Hezekiah was done for, absolutely done for. The Assyrians were going to walk all over him. But when he called on God, God already had the answer. And the answer wasn't even anywhere near, I'm sure, where Hezekiah would have thought the answer was going to go. But the devil was still there. And the devil's going to attack us every time God gives us an answer to prayer. So, friends, my takeout from the lesson was no matter what happens, the devil's still going to be chipping away, just like the Rabshakeh. Some truth, a whole lot of error. And we've got to discern it. Let's pray. God, we so much appreciate the story of Hezekiah when we can see it in that simple format that when a man laid